Malawi begins to starve. Starve means when you have no food and there's no resources and it feels like you're going to die of hunger. So in chapter 4, we learned that they were harvesting, so farming, maize, and they didn't get much because there was no water. And so all of their crops, their maize, was dying except for about 5 bags worth of food, which is nothing because that food has to last a year. Part of the answer arrived in late September. Not long after taking our final exams, Gilbert and I went to the trading center to play a few games of Bawo. As we walked back to his house, I noticed something odd. About a dozen people, so 12 people, were gathered in his yard, talking in low, worried voices. They were mostly women, each wearing brightly colored headscarves like my own mother, and carrying an empty basket. Who are these people? I asked. Remember, Gilbert's dad was an important man that died. They've run out of food in the faraway villages, Gilbert said. These women have come to ask my father for handouts or ganyu. Some of them walked for days. Ganyu was another word for day labor or a small job such as clearing fields or digging ridges for some money or food. It's how many farmers in Malawi made a living when times were hard. But I never seen this many people at once. So loads of people without food because of the fact that there is no water means they're coming to Gilbert's house to try and get help. What's your father going to do? I said. He's going to feed them, Gilbert answered. He has no choice. He's their chief. He's their, their director. What Gilbert said was true. The drought, so no water, had destroyed all of the crops in the countryside. Crops are the things that they grow for food. And the families in the smaller villages had run out of food. Their storage rooms were empty, and now they were hungry. I came home and told my father what I had seen, what I witnessed. He'd also seen the lines of women, but he didn't seem too concerned. He explained that the government always kept giant stocks or bags of maize for emergencies. In tough times like these, they sold it on the market for a reduced price so that everyone could afford to eat. Don't worry, he said. Whatever the case may be, our family has never gone hungry. A few days later, however, my father returned from the trading center, where a group of farmers had held a rally like a protest. They delivered some terrible news. A few dishonest, so bad people in the government sold our emergency maize and took off with the money. They're saying there's nothing left, he told my mother. This year will be a disaster. My mother's face seemed stricken. Only God can help us, she whispered. After that, hunger came to Malawi. Due to the shortage of maize, the price doubled in the market. When this happened, people started hunting for food in the forest, killing animals. One evening before dinner, I was feeling a bit hungry, so I walked next door to see if I could snatch a few mangoes from Mr. Mwali's trees. And I arrived. He and his family were sitting down to steaming plates of food. Just in time, I said. But when I looked closer, I realized what the Mulawis were eating. Pumpkin leaves and stewed green mangoes. They weren't even ripe, and I'm sure they tasted awful. You'll find no food here, Mr. Mwali said, wrinkling his nose as he chewed. Later, I saw several men digging ridges in Mwali's field for ganyu. Remember, ganyu is like some money or food. They were from the outer villages, and each walked away carrying a handful of the same green mangoes. A few days later, walking through the trading center, I saw something I'd never seen. Women had spread out plastic tarps and were selling gaga. Gaga are the clear-colored outer leaves or chaff that are removed from the maize kernels in the mill. So the part of the maize that you don't really eat, these women are selling it. It's mostly garbage left on the mill floor and tossed away. Farmers fed it to their chickens and pigs. I like to use gaga in my bird traps, but I'd never seen people eat it. Yet here, it was selling in the market for 300 kwacha a pail, 3 times what it normally cost. A group of women held metal buckets and crowded around the sellers, pushing one another to get some. "Move away, I was here first." "We're all hungry, sister. There are no firsts in that." When I returned an hour later, all the gaga was gone. Right then, I felt a shock pass through me. As if someone had shaken me awake in the night, I started running home. Until then, I hadn't worried much about our own situation. Being 13 years old and always hungry explained some of that. He's used to being hungry. Each meal, I'd stick out my plate and ask for more, ask for seconds, saying, "That's right, keep it coming." Sure, I knew about the problems throughout the country, but for some reason, I always assumed they were happening to someone else. Now, as I headed home, I grew more and more afraid. When I reached the house and opened the door to the storage room, I nearly fainted. Only 2 bags of grain remained. In my mind, they were already gone. Usually it's full of grain, but now there's just 2 bags. I started doing the math, doing the hunger math. 2 bags of maize wouldn't last 2 months. In 3 months, we would be starving. Worse, there were still 210 days, about 7 months until our next harvest, by the time our food will be ready next. We hadn't even planted 1 seed. And once we did plant, there was no guarantee it would rain or that we would even have fertilizer. A few days later, my father started rounding up our goats to sell in the market. In Malawi, your animals are the most important things, your most prized possessions. A farmer's only token of wealth and class. Now we were trading them for a few pails of maize. The man who ran the Kanyenya stands selling fried meat had enormous power now. The prices they offered for goats, pigs, and cows went lower each day. Yet people still lined up to sell. I noticed one of the goats was Mankahala, one of my favorites. Unlike the other goats, he loved to play. He would let me grab his horns and wrestle in the courtyard. He and Kamba, which is the dog, so the goat and the dog, had also become friends, and they would chase each other around the kitchen, annoying, irritating my mother. "Papa, why are you selling our goats?" I asked. He turned to me. "A week ago the price was 500. Now it's 400. I'm sorry, William, but if we wait any longer, we'll get no money. We'll get nothing." The goats were tied by the legs with rope and already crying. Kamba, the dog, heard the commotion, heard the noise, and came to investigate. When he saw Mankala being led down the trail with the others, he started to bark and jump. Mankala then turned around as if to plead, to ask for help. The goat knew his fate. But as much as it hurt me inside, I had to watch him go. What could I do? My family had to eat. In early November, I started waking up as usual at 4 a.m. to make my ridges, which is how they plant the maize seeds. On the first morning, when I walked inside to have my breakfast, my father met me in the darkness. "No falla today," he said. "Huh?" "It's time to start cutting back. We need to save our food." By this time, our supply of maize was just 1.5 bags. Breakfast was first to go, and I wondered what would be next, so no more breakfast. But instead of complaining, I drank a big cup of water, grabbed my hoe, which is what they used to dig the holes, and went to meet Jeffrey in the fields. I told him about skipping breakfast. "Can you believe it?" I asked. But my cousin simply shrugged. "You're just starting that today," he said. "I haven't had breakfast in 2 weeks. I'm getting used to it. In the early morning, the weather was still cool and nice, and I could dig my ridges with great energy. But by 7 a.m., my stomach had woken up and realized it was empty. It growled and rumbled and demanded to be filled. Soon the sun was high in the sky and sucking all of my strength. The only thing keeping me awake was my father marching past. "Make those ridges better," he shouted. "But I'm too hungry, Papa." "Think about next year's harvest, son. Try your best." It was true. My ridges looked crooked. They should be straight, as if a slithering snake had dug them. Across the field, Joffrey was hard at work. "Mr. Joffrey," I called out, "you dig my ridges today and I'll dig yours tomorrow. Can we make this deal?" "I'll think about it," he said, gasping for breath. "But it sounds like the same deal as yesterday." I was trying to raise my cousin's spirits and make him happier. Ever since his father died, he hadn't been the same. He looked sad, and sometimes he stayed in his room for an entire day and didn't speak to anyone. He was also sickly, so he's sick. At a recent trip to the clinic, the doctor said he had anemia, which is caused by having a bad diet, so eating bad. I later discovered that breakfast wasn't the only thing Jeffrey was skipping. Food was running low all around. "I'm joking," I shouted. "But seriously, man, you don't look good. Take a break and get some rest." "I have no choice," he said, swinging his hoe. "You know my deal." I also knew that Jeffrey wouldn't be returning to school in the next term. Because of the drought and losing her husband, Jeffrey's mother didn't have the money to pay his school fees. And anyway, she needed Jeffrey and his brother Jeremiah to work and provide food. That day, I pretended not to know. "Soon, your man Kamwamba will be in secondary school, where he belongs," I said, "wearing trousers and walking tall." "He'll find us there," Jeffrey said. "We older boys have plans for Kamwamba." "You can't touch him." "Oh, you wait and see." Jeffrey wasn't the only one changing. Gamba was also slowing down. I'd always known that his best years were behind him, which is the dog, and back when he lived on the estate, but now his age was starting to show. And ever since the drought, he'd grown thinner. The food I was feeding him at night wasn't enough, I guess. As he got slower, the mice in the fields outwitted him, and other dogs beat him to the scraps in the garbage piles. Kamba no longer chased chickens around the courtyard, but stayed inside the shade and slept. I was beginning to see his ribs, so even the dog is suffering. One night, when I tossed a bowl of ninsma for him to eat, he lost sight of it, and it landed right on his head. "What's the problem, old man?" I teased. He leaned over and sucked down the food in one gulp. Some things didn't change. December arrived with dark skies and heavy rain. All across the region, farmers did their best to plant seed for the next harvest, yet many had abandoned their fields in order to search for food. It wasn't long before their land was choked with weeds. Excuse me. Ooh. My father managed to plant a small plot of maize, but without any fertilizer. Remember, fertilizer is the thing that keeps it growing. He also found enough seed for 1/2 acre of tobacco, which would prove a lifesaver in the months to come. They would sell the tobacco. What began as drought and hunger in Malawi soon evolved into full-blown famine. That winter, it would tighten its grip until few people were left standing. So it was getting so bad, the situation of no food at all. Those looking for food began to come together in the trading center and along the roads. Groups of men carrying their hoes went house to house asking for work, their clothes soaked from the rain and covered in mud. At each place they heard the same reply: "We have nothing to give." While the men searched for Ganyu, their wives gathered at the chief's house, where Gilbert passed out bags of flour at the door. Already hundreds of people who had received food, but more kept coming. They carried children who cried from empty bellies, and some women were so weak that they fainted, they passed out once they arrived. After Gilbert's mother nursed them back to health, they continued down the road in search of their next bite of food. The famine arrived at our door sooner than I imagined. During the second week of December, my mother milled our last pail of maize, giving us just 12 more meals. As soon as she left, I opened the storage room and peered and looked inside. All that remained were empty bags piled in the corner like dirty laundry. I tried to remember what the room had looked like when it was full, but I just didn't have the energy. That night, my father called the family into the living room. "Given our situation," he said, "I've decided it's better if we go down to 1 meal per day. It's the only way we will make it." My sisters and I argued over which meal it should be. "We should have breakfast," said Aisha, who was 12. "I like lunch," shouted Doris. "No," my father said. "It will be supper, dinner. It's easier to keep your mind off hunger during the day, but no person should have to sleep with an empty stomach. We will eat at night." My stomach was used to being fed every time it grumbled. Having no breakfast was one thing, but not eating breakfast or lunch was a lesson in patience and in pain. It was even harder on my younger sisters, who didn't understand why no one would feed them. "Did you hear me, Mama?" they cried. "I'm hungry." "Yes, dear," my mother said. "I heard you. Just try to hold on." Dinner didn't come soon enough that first night. My father lit a lantern in the living room, and we all gathered around, watching the black soot spiral towards the ceiling, the smoke. As usual, we started with hand washing. My sister Doris walked around to each person and poured the warm water over their hands while they lathered up with soap and rinsed over the basin. When washing was finished, finally my mother fetched 2 bowls and lifted the lids. "Try to make it last, try to make it go longer," she said, and joined us on the floor, because they eat on the floor. The first bowl contained insima, but instead of a mountain of steaming cakes, this was just one grey blob. It didn't even look edible, like you could eat it. In the second bowl, my mother had prepared a small portion of mustard greens. We passed the food around and didn't even bother using plates. The meal was over in minutes. With less than 1 pail of flour remaining, I knew that only a miracle could save us, or at least a very good idea. The next morning, my father announced his brilliant plan. "We're selling all of our food," he said. It didn't make any sense to me. In fact, it seemed like the worst idea I'd ever heard. But then he explained how we would use our flour to make cakes to sell in the market. The extra money we earned would go towards buying more food. It was a huge risk, a huge gamble. That morning, my mother mixed the last of our flour with some soy powder and sugar and made zugumu cakes, which looked like small cookies, small biscuits. The delicious smell of them baking over the fire drifted through the sheets of rain and onto the road, stopping the Ganyu men in their tracks. Remember, Ganyu men are people looking for work. Even the birds became brave and gathered outside the kitchen to sing a very sad song. The aroma, the smell, entered my body like a spirit, slithering into my empty belly and stretching its arms and legs. Normally, when my mother made zugumu cakes, she'd let me scrape the bowl with my fingers. In Malawi, this was such a cherished privilege that kids had given it a name. VP, after Vipassi pot, meaning the bottom of the pot. So whenever the mom would be making the cakes, whatever's left, young William would get to eat it. "Mama, VP?" we would ask, our eyes round with excitement and anticipation. But this time was different. My mother used every single last drop of batter, as if wiping it clean with a sponge. No VP, no extras, only the empty pot. That night, my father made a stand from a broken table and an iron sheet. My mother opened for business the following morning, selling her cakes for 3 kwacha each. The cakes were heavy and lasted longer in the belly than some of the other cheap breads for sale in the market. If a person didn't have enough money to buy flour, the cakes were their only option. That first day she sold everything in less than 20 minutes. During these hard times, everyone learned the lesson of supply and demand, so people giving and people taking. The rule of economics and money says that whenever the supply of something is great, for example, the farmers have a good crop like any other year, the demand will be low and so will the price be. So if there's a lot of something, it gets cheaper. But when it's the opposite, when the supply or when the amount of something is low, like now during the famine, the demand is overwhelming, everyone wants some, and the prices soar into the heavens. So what he's saying that is normally there's so much corn that it doesn't cost much. But now because there is none, it costs so much more. Ever since the country ran out of maize, businessmen had been traveling into neighboring countries like Tanzania and buying it by the truckful. So people go into other countries to buy it. Back in Wimbe Market, they raised the price, partly because gasoline was expensive and sometimes the trucks broke down. But also, they charged more because they knew people were starving and would pay anything to stay alive. Luckily, one of the traders, so the people selling the maize, Mr. Mangochi, was my father's friend and agreed to cut us a deal. For the money my mother earned selling cakes, Mangochi sold her another pail of maize. My mother took it to the mill, saving half the flour for more cakes, while the other half went to us. It was just enough to provide and give us our blob of nisma each night, plus some pumpkin or mustard leaves as relish to go with it. It didn't erase our hunger, but knowing one of our meals was safe made it less painful. As long as we can stay in business, we can make it through, my father told us. Our profit, so the money we make, is that we stay alive. A couple of weeks later, my mother was coming home from the market when a giant truck passed her on the road. Its load, so what was inside, was covered with tarps, and some of the other traders said it was maize. They're taking it to the government store in Chamama, someone told her. When my mother got home, she called me over and explained the news. You will go to Chamama tomorrow. Leave as early as possible. Chamama was 12 miles away, like 18 kilometers away. So of course I grumbled. Are you sure it was maize and not fertilizer? Because I heard that. Are you listening to me, boy? My mother snapped. She did not like her children talking back, especially not now. You go tomorrow. If my mother was right, it was great news. It meant the government had found surplus, a lot of maize, perhaps from Tanzania, and would sell it for a discount, sell it for cheaper. With prices climbing higher and higher in the market, it was the only way we could get ahead. The next morning, I woke up at 5 a.m. and set off on my bicycle for Chamama. An empty flour sack fluttered from my handlebars, so he has a big bag that's empty. And as I rattled down the narrow dirt roads, I noticed many others carrying the same. Chamama? I asked them. Hey, they replied, nodding. The government store was located in the central market. When I finally arrived, I saw the lines of people stretched from the door all the way down the road, longer than 2 soccer fields. One line was for men, while the other was for women and children. Each was getting longer by the minute. So I parked my bike against a fence and took my place among the men. A cool breeze blew from the lake and kept people in good spirits. But once the scorching hot sun rose in the sky, the hunger revealed itself in everyone. You know, when you get hungry, you get angry. People suddenly appeared exhausted, as if they hadn't slept in days. The skin around their faces was shrunken and their eyes squinted against the hard light. It had probably been weeks since many had eaten a proper meal, and the government store was their last and only hope of survival. As the sun rose hotter, they grew more and more feeble, so more weak and close to death. The man in front of me could hardly stay awake. His hands were shaking and trembling as if he were cold, and his breathing was heavy and loud. When the line started to move, he couldn't keep his balance and he fell down. To my horror, no one helped him up. They just simply stepped over him. In the next line, babies cried from hunger and children tugged at their mothers' dresses. If there's one thing I remember most about that day in Chumama, it's the sound of crying babies. After many and several hours in line, people got restless and angry at the sun and at the people pressed all around who were starving, reeked of sour rags. Angry at the government, at the dust, and at the very air that occupied the emptiness of their stomachs. So everyone's angry right now because they've not had food in so long or slept. As we inched closer and closer to the door, their impatience took control. People began and started to push. Someone shoved me so hard in the back that I grabbed hold of the man in front of me to keep me from falling down. A few boys from the end of the line then raced towards the front, squirming into the crowd like a mouse under a door. "Hey, stop cutting!" people shouted. "We've been here since dawn, since the sunrise." But they kept coming. Everyone knew that at some point the grain would run out, and no one wanted to be the loser left holding an empty bag, an empty sack. The more people cut in line, the more the others panicked. Suddenly, both lines ran towards the door at once. The waves of bodies lifted me off the ground and carried me forward. I felt the air being squeezed out of my lungs, and I saw the sky disappear above me. So people are charging now, running at the door. I was being swallowed by this enormous, terrifying group, and I was helpless against it. "Hey, stop!" I shouted. "I can't breathe!" But it was no use. So the mob is like a group, just a huge group of people running towards the door. As the mob trapped me in its belly, a strange thing happened. Everything went dark. The screams and moaning of children fell away. The shouting vanished. I went into slow motion, like I was underwater. For a second, I thought that maybe I was already dead, and a small part of me even felt happy and relieved. But no, through the cracks in the crowd, I saw the government building, now closer than ever. The crowd had carried me forward like a cyclone. I managed to get back on my feet on the ground and slither like a snake between the bodies. It helped being skinny. A minute later, I reached the front of the pack and stood on the porch of the building. Then I slipped through the doors. Inside, the office was cool and quiet, and in front of me was a hill of maize, as high as my waist. It was more food than I had seen in months, and I made it just in time. Outside the mob, the groups of people had exploded into one giant fight. Through the door, I watched a woman fall to the ground and vanish in the dust cloud. 2 more women carrying babies on their backs jumped out of the fight to avoid being crushed, losing their place in line. They brushed off their clothes, getting the dust off, and walked away with nothing. And I wondered if they would make it another month. "Hey!" a man shouted. "Next!" He was shouting at me. I said, "Next!" I hurried forward and placed my order. I had 400 kwacha in my pocket, enough to buy the 25 kilograms as advertised on the sign outside. But when I told him what I wanted, he told me that there had been a change. I could only buy 20, but the price was the same. "So how much do you want?" he said, not even looking up from his desk. 20. He gave me a ticket and pointed down the line, where several workers were using metal scoops to scoop the maize. They looked muscular and healthy, nothing like the people outside who were skinny. The man who measured my mice then cheated me. He threw the bucket onto the scale, so the scale is what you use to weigh and see how much it is, so quickly that I couldn't see the weight, then emptied it into my bag. "Next!" he screamed. "But wait," I said, "you didn't even—" He turned around. "If you don't like it, you can leave it here. There are plenty of people behind you. Next!" With no choice, I handed him my money, grabbed my sack, and ran for the door. Although I was robbed, I felt a rush of excitement to be holding so much food, though it quickly turned to fear once I stepped back out into the crowds. A man ran towards me, shouting, "I'll give you 500 for that." Another pushed him aside. "No, boy, I'll give you 600. I pretended not to hear. I strapped the maze to my bike as fast as I could, and I sped away, cycling fast. Once I reached the road, I didn't stop pedaling until I saw my family's house. As I rolled into the courtyard, my mother and sisters greeted me like I was a hero. I was exhausted, and my clothes were torn and ruined from the crowd. When I tossed the mice onto my father's scale, it had been confirmed that they cheated me. 15 kilos, I said, only half a bag. My mother told me not to worry. You did fine, and because of you, we will eat for another week. In the days after Chamama, which is where he went, people started selling their possessions, their furniture, to stay alive. One morning during a heavy rain, I sat on the porch and watched a line of them pass like slow-moving ants. Women carried giant pots on their heads, containing items from their kitchen like cups, spoons, knives, everyday things of a normal life unhinged. Men lugged and carried chairs and sofas on their back. One man dragged a heavy dining room table through the mud. They were all going to the trading center to see how much money or mice they could get. Because what good was a kitchen table when you have no food to eat on it? Kamba, the dog, lay sprawled out on the ground at my feet. Every few seconds his tail flipped in slow motion at the flies that gathered on his back. He was getting thinner and more weak, and I knew it was all my fault. My mother's one meal a day did not include our dog. The only way Kamba ate was if I shared my portion, and most days I was so hungry that I ate it all without thinking. Lately, in the middle of the night, his complaints and groans of hunger had woken me from my sleep, and I would stay awake, burning with guilt, feeling terrible. It was difficult to even look at him now, so once the rain let up that morning, I left him on the porch and followed the people to the trading center. He didn't try to follow. The hunger had changed the town. Most of the shops, like Mr. Bander's, were now shuttered and closed, and the market women had abandoned their stalls. The merchants and the traders now joined the multitude of starving people looking for food and selling their lives away. "Indiri, Indiri Malonda," a man called out. "I've got something to sell. How about this radio? It's yours for a giveaway price." So everyone's selling everything they have just for food. One man sold the iron sheets from his roof for a cup of flour. A nice straw roof could fetch half a cup. "What good is a roof when you're dead?" he asked. A few of the businessmen, like Mr. Mangocci, brought their neighbors furniture and later gave it back. But the truth was that most people had no money to buy anything. They simply shook their heads and walked away. Inside the maize mill, a crowd of desperate children gathered around the machine. When the rare women came to grind a pile of maize, they watched the flour cloud rise from the bucket with dancing eyes. As soon as the customer removed the pail from the spout, the children threw themselves on the floor and wiped it clean. By mid-December, there was hardly any grain to mill anymore, and the building fell to silence. So what they would do is they would take the grains, what they were making, the maize, and they would put it in the mill, and you would turn it, and out you get flour. Flour that you would use to make things. But now there's none of that. Then Christmas arrived. Normally it was my favorite holiday. In better times, we put our nicest clothes on Christmas Eve and watched the Nativity play at church. Later that night, my sisters and I would catch swarms of the flying ants that arrived each rainy season, then roast them in a flat pan with salt and eat them with nsima. Whereas grasshoppers have kind of a nutty flavor, roasted ants taste like chewy dried onions, except more delicious. When eaten along with beans and pumpkin leaves, they are truly heavenly, very good. Christmas morning breakfast was typically fresh sliced bread, slathered with Blue Band margarine and a mug of steaming jombe tea. A Blue Band sandwich washed down with milky, sugary tea is the greatest combination you can put inside of your mouth. Like anyone, Malawians love meat on Christmas. Early in the afternoon, my father usually kills one of our biggest chickens and gives it to my mother to cook. But Christmas chicken is not served with nsima. As I mentioned before, it comes with rice. Ask any Malawian about Christmas dinner and they'll always mention rice. But on Christmas 2001, we had none of this stuff. First of all our chickens had died from disease a few weeks earlier because we couldn't afford the medicine. All that remained was one lonely hen, who had become kind of the symbol of everything we lost. No one would dare to touch her. All of the churches cancelled their Christmas Eve nativity ceremonies because of the hunger, and that night my sisters and I felt so weak anyway that we didn't even bother catching ants to eat. When Christmas morning rolled around, there was no sliced bread or Blue Band, no tea, and I knew there would not be any chicken and rice either. I felt so sad that I sat on the edge of my bed and I didn't move. I heard the sounds of the radio come through my door. The DJ was playing Silent Night, and it only made me angry. How dare they play that song, I thought. I grabbed my hoe and headed straight for the field. Anything to keep my mind off Christmas. Around noon, my mother did manage to serve us a holiday lunch, but it was just the usual blob of nsima. She probably worked very hard to save enough flour for that extra meal, but it was impossible to eat with a happy heart. Afterwards, I went to go see Geoffrey, which made me feel even worse. I found him sitting on his bed, looking thin and tired. Ever since his mother ran out of food the previous month, Geoffrey had been one of the people on the roads searching for a ganyu. Remember, ganyu is looking for extra work. He found work making ridges and pulling weeds, but it didn't provide enough food for his whole family, and often they went many days without eating. And even worse, he had not been taking care of and neglecting his maize crop. "Oh man," I said, "I haven't seen you in days. Your field is full of weeds. They're taking over." "Too busy with ganyu," he said. "At first, I went looking for enough food for the month, then the week. Now it's all about tomorrow and today." I hadn't seen Gilbert in a while, so I walked over to his house. About 50 people were camped out in his yard when I arrived, and the smoke from their fires covered the place in a dismal haze. Gilbert was standing in the doorway. "Merry Christmas, eh?" I said, being sarcastic, joking. "Not here," he asked. "Well, surely Chief Wimbe has prepared some delicious chicken and rice." Gilbert shook his head in disappointment. "These people have taken almost everything from us. It's only beans and nsima today." My nose caught something terrible on the breeze. It made my lips curl, some horrible smell. "What is that?" I asked. "Oh," he said, pointing toward the campers, people camping outside. "They're not even bothering with the latrine anymore. Now they're just defecating, pooping in our grass. Be careful where you walk." "Yeah, for sure." With Geoffrey busy with ganyu and Gilbert busy with hungry people, I decided to see if my cousin Charity was around. Charity was a few years older. His parents lived in another village while he worked the fields around Wimbe. He lived by himself in a kind of cool clubhouse where teenage boys gathered to discuss soccer, girls, and whatever else. I never really knew, since most of the time they kicked me out. Whenever one of them said, "William, I think I hear your mother calling," I knew it was my signal to leave. This time, though, Charity seemed happy to see me. No one wants to be alone on the holidays. He invited me inside where a small fire was burning in a cooking pot. "It's Christmas and I'm starving. I'm so hungry," he said. "I haven't eaten a thing." "Yeah," I said. "I'm hungry too." The two of us began thinking of ways to get food. The mangoes were all eaten and gone, and the businessmen in the trading center wouldn't dare give us any flour. "What about James?" I said. Our friend James ran a kind of Kenyaya stand, but instead of selling fried goat meat, he boiled the brains and hooves, something called head cheese. Trust me, it's more delicious than it sounds. In fact, my mouth watered thinking about it. Oh, the brains and the feet of goats? Ooh. "Perhaps James will be generous on Christmas and let us have some," I said, feeling confident. Charity waved me off. "Don't be stupid." Then his eyes brightened and he said, "But he does throw away the skin." "Can you eat that?" I asked, twisting my face. "I'm thinking why not? What's the difference? It's all meat, right?" "Yeah, I guess you're right." The hunger had screwed up our brains. On the way to see James, we passed the other Kanyenya stands. A group of wealthy businessmen stood around eating meat and fried potatoes. They laughed and joked as they ate the greasy bits, not even stopping to swallow before stuffing their faces again. Nor did they notice the crowd of villagers that gathered around just to watch them eat. To these men, the hunger was invisible. James's stand was just down the road. He was there as usual, hunching over his boiling pot. As we got closer, I could see a goat head bobbing inside the water, along with some leg pieces. My stomach howled and I had to look away. James," Charity said, William and I are making a Christmas drum for the children in the village. We're wondering if you could spare one of your skins." "That's a good idea," said James. He turned and nodded towards a black mound in the dirt, swarming with flies. "Take that one there. I was going to throw it out anyway." Charity grabbed the goat skin, and stuffed it into a jumbo bag, and then handed it to me. It was still warm. "Zikomo kwa mbriri," Charity said. "Thanks a lot. The kids will appreciate you." Sure. We hurried back to Charity's house, wasting no time. "How are we supposed to prepare this?" I asked, looking inside the bag. "Easy," said Charity. "We just cook it like a pig." Back inside, I added some twigs to the fire and got it going again. Once it was good and hot, Charity and I held the corners of the hide and stretched it over the flames. The hair of the goat sizzled and flared off and gave a terrible smell. Once it looked burnt and charred enough, we took our knives and scraped it away. We did this again and again until it was properly cleaned. We cut the skin into strips and threw them into a pot of boiling water, adding a little salt and baking soda. "What's the soda for? It's not like gaseous or something else?" I asked. "It's how the women make their beans cook faster," he said. "I'm thinking it works with skin too." After 3 hours, a thick white foam formed on top of the water. Charity took out his knife and fished through the froth, pulling out a steaming piece of skin. It was grey and slimy. He blew on it to cool it down, then popped it into his mouth. His jaws worked and worked, trying to chew it up. Finally, he swallowed. "How was it?" I asked. "A little tough, but we're out of firewood, so let's eat." I snagged a long piece of skin with my knife and held it with my fingers. It was sticky, as if covered with glue. I stuffed it into my mouth and breathed in, feeling the rush of heat instantly calm my angry belly. As I chewed, the juices sealed my lips shut. "Merry Christmas," I managed to say. "Ja, Merry Christmas." Just then I heard a clawing at the door and realized it was Gamba, the dog. He must have smelled the Christmas meat all the way from home and came running. His bony frame was bent and tired, but his tail was wagging. I was glad to see him. "Give some to that dog," Charity called out. "It's dog's food we're eating anyway." I bent down and rubbed Gamba's head. "Let's get you something to eat, chap. I'm sure you're starving." I tossed Gamba a long piece of skin, and to my surprise, he jumped up and snatched it from the air, just like old times. I went to the pot and pulled out 2 more giant handfuls. After he finished his meal, the life seemed to return to his body. I lost count of how many pieces I ate, but after about half an hour of chewing, Charity and I gave up because our jaws were too tired. Our mouths were so tired. As the sun went down that afternoon, the 3 of us sat around the cold fire, content with the warm feeling of meat in our stomachs, because that's what Christmas was all about anyway. So this chapter we learn how difficult it was for the families selling all of their things, riding every day to get maize, trying their best to find work for money. And at the end, it's Christmas, and they end up finding goat skin and boiling it for food. That's how desperate and sad the situation had